Good evening, everyone. This week, IAC in Milan blew away their record books this last week, but they did get upstage at least once. We're going to meet the winner of September's micro grant, Jeff Carlson of Mithralome, and a recent book explains that we are in a new space race with China, and it's heating up everything. A lot that and more coming up. From the news desk at the Center for Space Commerce and Finance, I'm Thomas Andrew Olson, and this is The Unknown Quantity. Good evening and welcome, everyone. If you're new here, just a few words of introduction. So, what is what we call the Center all about? Well, we're about the business of doing the business of space. We champion and strengthen emerging space startups, space scalable SMEs, and space adjacent enterprises worldwide through advisory, access, and advocacy across the funding spectrum. Our programs fortify business plans and investor readiness for founding teams at varying levels of development. That is our mission in life. Since 2007, we've hosted space investment summits throughout the US and even in Europe. Since 2009, we've operated the longest continuous space startup business pitch event, the New Space Business Plan Competition. We've helped 80 companies get introduced to the world and have awarded over $400,000 in prize money to over 20 of them. Our latest initiative is Space Micro Grants, where we award $1,000 to early stage startups each month, no strings attached, for whatever they need to do going forward. October is going to close soon, so Leah should be giving us a link to that, and then you can click the link below to apply. There's still a few days left. Now, let me introduce my co-host for the evening, Michael Lane, who's also a board member of the Center and CEO of Liftport. Michael, you with me yet?
I am. I was trying to put the link in. Hey, hi.
Hey, how you doing, man? We had to skip the last one because of a hurricane, but
yeah, how was that?
It could have been it was bad in some places and it could have been a lot worse in others. We came through it okay. There was my own neighborhood was all right. We lost a few trees, but I only lost power for like 30 minutes, and then but there's a lot of flooding, a lot more flooding than we saw with Ian. You know, regular major roads even were they had blocking them out. Lots of floods everywhere. There's even a little bit of flooding at one end of my neighborhood, but it doesn't really affect people moving around much. So that was great. Felt like we dodged a bullet or something. I don't know.
I had friends. So you're down there on the Space Coast and a little bit away from it.
Yeah, we're inland. We're almost dead. Yeah, we're about 40 miles inland from Daytona, Daytona Beach.
Yeah.
It's totally different. By the time when the winds are coming in from the west like that, by the time they hit us, they're not more than maybe 60, 70 miles an hour. And that's only the gusts.
Coming from Washington State, 60, 70 mile an hour winds would be pretty catastrophic around here.
I lived through that.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, decades ago in 1962, in October, and it was on Columbus Day. I remember the day. We had a typhoon come into Portland, Oregon, from where I was growing up,
right.
from the Pacific. They called them typhoons back then if they were in the Pacific. And they come roaring in with 100-mile-an-hour winds and knocked a whole bunch of trees down, and the power was down for days. And it was and when you're a little kid, it's like, oh, this is fun. This is great, But big widowmaker branches are going by the picture window, and mom's yelling at me, "Get away from there!"
Yeah.
So I've seen it happen, in the Northwest once. That's probably a once in a century kind of thing. Hopefully, it never happens again.
No, we don't have storms like that. Not in a long, long time. I did have friends down in Tampa, and they had $50,000 to $100,000 worth of damage to their place.
Yeah, and that was ground zero.
Yeah, that kind of iconic picture where somebody is on a kayak paddling down the street.
Yeah.
That was their front yard. So yeah, so it happens. Hey, let's kind of focus in on the micro grants for a second. Oh no, let's talk about. Sorry, I'm out of order here. Let's talk about Milan.
Milan, my God, I'm finally not jet lagging anymore. That was I had a rough experience getting over there because I was 2 days late
because of the storm.
I was going to go to the SGAC event as well, Space Generation Advisory Council, because I wanted to explain to them our micro grants. And it turns out every SGAC person I met at IAC were jumping up and down when I talked about micro grants to them, and some other people. But something important, actually, and I almost didn't put it in my notes, the Center for Space Commerce and Finance is now officially a member organization of IAF.
Wow, that's new even to me.
More involved in that than I realized. It's not just paying a little bit of dues, you know, every year. It is, it's a seat at the table. These are the people. They have 2 what they call General Assembly meetings, one at the beginning of the conference and one at the end. And this is where they vote on where the next IAC is going to be in coming years, and a lot of other things about the running of the IAC, how the IAC runs. You know, here's the proposed fee structure for Sydney for next year, and you got to vote on that and take comments. And there were a lot of comments, but we voted it in anyway. So a lot of interesting things going on that side, and the center now technically has a seat at the table, such as it is. Potentially.
So why is the Center for Space Commerce and Finance a member of the International Astronautics?
Okay, well, the reason we went for this was because we have an opportunity to do some great programming in IAF directly regarding what the center does. We're going to do a new space business plan competition in Sydney next year. That's going to just going to blow everybody's socks off. And I've been making plans behind the scenes. I already got whole sorts of boots on the ground. In fact, one of these guys, Jason Hell from Sabre Astronautics, he's down there. He's going to be one of the. It's going to be like a joint venture with his group. He already runs accelerators down there called the Fish Tank and the Wolf Pack, and those are actually well known in Australia. And so he has tie-ins with like every investor group down there. And the idea is we're going to attract some investor groups in to watch this from the U.S. and Europe, but we're going to get the entire entrepreneurial space community in Australia and New Zealand both involved. Yeah, I talked to some New Zealand people. They were excited to hear all about this, and they're all going to want to be involved. And I also got an intro, and I'm interacting with somewhat the core people who are actually putting on the program, the whole program for IAC. They're the organizers for Sydney, and so we're on their radar right now, and we're going to get in early. Unlike all the problems we've had before, trying to get on the schedule. You know, that's not. I fixed that.
Right. Yep.
So you're welcome.
I want to make sure that the people watching. Well, I want to make sure that the people that are watching and listening understand that while we've given out $400,000 over the last, almost 15 years worth of competitions, and while we're currently giving out $1,000 a month in the micro grant fund, we're anticipating many zeros of a prize at the at IAC next year.
Yeah,
so that's super exciting.
We have a goal, yes.
Yeah,
and we're going to meet it.
Yeah,
and it's going to be fun. It's going to be so much fun. A lot of great people are going to be there. But this is going to be. There's also some challenges for the Australian organizers, because IAC set a record-breaking attendance. 11,200 people signed on to this thing.
Wow.
I don't know how many of them, and they signed on and paid their money. I don't know how many actually came.
Right.
But more than half, that place was packed for 5 straight days. Awesome. And everybody stayed for everything right through the gala on Friday night. It was just insane. I lost about 5 pounds.
Well, I'm sorry you weren't able to get the SGAC. That's an
Yep.
important part of
But
the
yeah, but I
plan.
did meet some important people involved in that, and some other people who were not involved, but were also working with youth and doing a lot of development work, on accelerators and stuff like that. They were very interested in our micro grants and everything else we were doing, and I'm having follow up conversations with all these people. I've made about 25 new friends.
Nice.
I like to put it. That was my goal as a person and a marketing and trying to do outreach for the center. I said, I'm going to make 5 new friends a day.
Excellent.
You know what? And I did it.
Well,
and they're all just incredible people, and I'm looking forward to and they're from all over the world. And so I'm going to have some really great conversations here in the coming weeks.
Well, so IAC was great, but wasn't there something that was kind of a showstopper there?
Yes. We should talk about that. Because IAC, they always start with a bang, with a big opening event, on Monday morning, right off the top. But this year, interestingly, they were upstaged by that, and then again by this. What an event. What an event. Now, I got to say, I mentioned this years ago I felt that I think it was February 6, 2018 is when the 21st century truly began, because that was the first launch of Falcon Heavy. Mm-hmm. And the twin boosters both came down next to each other at the same time. That's going to be where people start saying that's when the 21st century started.
Right.
But this is a follow-up event that just beats that to me. This is just absolutely insane. And it's only 6 years later.
Yeah.
My God. We're on our way, man. We are on our way.
If you can put the phrase engineering and miracle in the same sentence, this was an engineering miracle.
This is it. I hope they can just keep doing it over and over and over. That's the important part.
Yeah.
I want to see the second one and the third one and the 90th one. That's going to be where we go with that.
Well, and SpaceX hit over 100 launches so far this year. So I think they're at 101 or 102 or 103 this year.
They finally met the goal. They hit the century mark. That's pretty amazing. So I just want to get to that. So IAC was incredible. That's going to be a hard act to follow for the folks in Sydney, but Sydney's an incredible venue to do anything, for this kind of stuff. And they've got a lot to show off now since the last one in Australia and I went to it. It was in Adelaide in 2017. And that's when they first got their space agency back.
Right. Yep.
And Elon Musk was there first touting what he called the BFR at the time. It wasn't called Starship. Right. And he was there talking about that. And so a lot of great things happened then. And now this is going to be an incredible follow-up next year. So 8 years later, it's going to be amazing. And so moving on, we have with us our first guest tonight is a guy named Dr. Jeff Carlson. He is the founder of Mithralone, and he is our September $1,000 Space Micro Grant winner. Jeff, welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on The Unknown Quantity. I really appreciate it.
Great. It's explain Mithralone to me. It's pretty interesting. It's like, and I'm usually pretty sharp at this stuff, but even some of it went over my head just a little bit. So regale us, please.
Yeah, no, of course, no problem. Mithralone is primarily a microbe-based company. So we use fungi, bacteria, viruses in order to solve problems both on Earth and in space. we focus on bioremediation as well as biomanufacturing. So we like to use these microbes in order to help clean up the environment, as well as produce different kinds of products. And you can see how these kinds of mechanisms that happen on Earth can be co-opted for some potential space applications. The name mithrilome is a little bit dorky. I'm a little bit of a Lord of the Rings fan. Mithril is a fantasy metal from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and that is the basis of the name mithrilome. And then ohm is for multi-omics. So you've heard of genomics, but there's also proteomics and metabolomics. So when you fuse the two together, it's sort of the study and the omics of metals. So that's what we began to focus on, is using these microbes to process and help recycle metals. So when you think about potential space applications for this, you'd have to really start to look at and emphasize in situ resource utilization. So instead of launching a whole bunch of metal precursors up into space so you can build novel things, what you'd really want to do is use metallic groups that are already in space, whether that's on the moon, regolith, or if that's going to be on Mars with basalt, or any of the other metal compounds that are present on asteroids, meteorites, etc. That way you don't have to launch a whole bunch of metal precursors up to start building different kinds of structures in space. You could launch something maybe the size of this. And this tube can hold up to 1 million different spores of fungi. And then what you can do is use carbon sources to grow them up. And then they can begin to process and refine metals specifically that you find on the moon, Mars, and beyond.
Okay, so let's say you plant something like that on Mars, and your goal is to get a specific kind of metal compound. Okay.
Well, yeah.
Is that the goal, to get that out of the soil, or out of the regolith, maybe?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So our microbes have been modified so that they are able to bind to specific metal groups. And then this allows you to isolate the metals that you find most important. So if you want to make a lithium-ion battery, the microbe would be able to sort out lithium, for example, or if you need copper, iron, etc.
Okay. Okay, so let's say this thing gets on Mars and it gets away from you.
Sure.
Then it eventually covers the whole planet, and now it has a whole new sheen to it because, you were getting chromium or something.
Right. The inverse of what we're so afraid of on planet Earth is we're actually the aliens. So planetary defense is actually something that we're very mindful of and concerned about for mithrilome. So what we do is we implant various kinds of genetic switches that kill the microbes if they get out of hand. So we wouldn't want to release them onto the surface, for example. We would use it primarily as a refining step in a self-contained bioreactor. However, what happens if there's a leak? What happens if it spills out? This is a big issue on Earth as well in the biomining industry. If you're trying to get Rio Tinto or Vale mining companies trying to isolate iron compounds, they do microbes for that. What happens if they leak out? At Mithrilome, what we do is we've engineered some synthetic kill switches. So our microbes lack certain components that they need to live, and we supplement that to them in the medium. And then they also produce an artificial toxin. So we provide the antidote in our incubator. So if they ever get out, they're not only going to miss the food that they need to live, but they're also going to start producing an internal toxic substance that kind of will lead to their untimely demise. But that's why we reward good behaving microbes rather than have them escape from the bioreactor.
Okay.
Is that the same tech they used during Jurassic Park?
It's a bit different. I think it would be great to be able to have the funds to bring back the Tyrannosaurus Rex.
No, that's not what I meant. Like they had a lysine element.
Oh, yeah, they had a substitution, right? Yeah. No, it's a bit different. Okay. And because there's redundancies in it, it's both the presence of a toxin and the absence of something important. So if there's a mutation, for example, where it adapts, say, I don't need to live without lysine or something, for example, it'll still accumulate that toxin if it escapes. So that way we have a little bit double layer protection or triple layer, because they still have to get out of the bioreactor too,
Let's not get them out.
For international, legal things going on with stuff like that. You're going to launch something to Mars, and it's highly biological. And does it in any way fall under ITAR regulations?
That is a gray area, and it's something that I'm interested in kind of viewing with a little bit more of a more pronounced regulatory committee, because these are the kinds of questions that we need to start to be able to address, especially when you have just smaller emissions like growing plant life on the moon, for example. What plants are allowed? Is there biocontainment necessary? What kind of necessity is there for biocontainment? Who's allowed to do what? Who's responsible if something happens? These are the kinds of questions that eventually we're going to have to start asking, because the time is accelerating to answer those questions.
Right.
And we'll be discussing this with our next guest in a minute too, because when you look at the regulatory environment for just sending something somewhere, that's one big thing that we have to deal with. Well, there's almost an equally large regulatory issue for bringing something back.
Yeah.
And so that also may factor someday into what you're doing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I know Vardis Space had a little bit of an issue bringing back their payload.
Yep.
And they're another biomanufacturing company that uses microgravity as a discovery-based platform.
Right.
So having that sort of, let's say, faux pas occur, the mission was eventually successful, but not without some hurdles that had to be jumped over. So I think that brought to light some of the importance of these questions that we're beginning to ask. And we really need to start accelerating what these guidelines, criteria, metrics, standards, etc., are going to be put in place for these kinds of questions, because they're becoming more relevant by the day.
There was a mission that was that crash landed on the moon about 5 years ago. I might have my timelines wrong. I think it was about 5 years ago, and they brought tardigrades to the moon. Now, there were not quote unquote repercussions from that, and a lot of people were pretty surprised that they snuck those little critters onto the mission. But that stuff is happening, and we do need to be aware of it. Jeff, what do you want to do? Again, I want to stress that it's a no strings attached micro grant, but what do you want to do with your newfound $1,000?
First and foremost, big help, especially for a startup. Every dollar counts. So in this respect, I can't be more appreciative or thank you guys enough for it. But in this respect, what to do with the seed grant? What we're primarily trying to do is determine whether or not there are any kind of mutational or epigenetic anomalies that occurred to our microbes while they were on the International Space Station back between March and April.
Okay.
So we had an approximately 36-day length time exposed to microgravity, which may result in some epigenetic changes. But while you're in space, you're also exposed to cosmic radiation. Now, there's a bunch of shielding that prevents this, but you're in space, so these things can still have an effect. Right. And we're curious to try to determine whether or not certain changes occurred in our microbes that not maybe adapted them to space, but allows them to be a little bit less stressed out in that environment. So primarily what we're going to be doing is we have a bunch of sequencing already performed. And what we need to do is we need to do the bioinformagic, as we like to call it. It's bioinformatics, but I don't know how it works. So to me, it's magic. So bioinformagic, in order to determine what these potential changes are and how they can affect cellular behavior. All
right. Jeff Carlson, PhD. Thank you so much for being on the show, and stay in touch. Keep us up with what's going on. I want to stay connected and check your progress.
Of course, I'll keep your finger on the pulse.
Absolutely.
Consider coming to IAC in Sydney, because it's going to be a big prize for that. And between now and a year from now, you all have hopefully made some progress. So
I'm excited to produce the data, and I'll try to meet you guys out there in Australia next year.
Right on. Good luck.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Take care. Okay, amazing guy and very loquacious, and in a good way. In a good way. Okay, for our final and longest segment of the evening, according to our next guest, we are in a new space race with China, where in fact everything is at stake, and the penalty for losing may be too horrible to contemplate. I want to introduce tonight Dr. Greg Autry. He and Peter Navarro are co-authors of a book called Red Moon Rising, and we're going to talk tonight about just that problem. This is not your father's space race at all, and there's a lot more at stake for the whole world involved in this. Greg, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
Okay. I did read your book cover to cover. I was fascinated by it. I read it on the plane going to and from Milan. It was quite excellent. And the first, what I'll get into first, I mean, about the first 20% or so of the book really explains the problem, which is always going to, I always tell our entrepreneur trainees that go through our program, describe the problem you're trying to fix. And you spent about the first 20% of your book doing just that. And it's in some way, it's almost scary as hell. But tell our audience why this is not their grandfather's space race and what's really at stake going forward.
Yeah. And, I want to be clear. It's not necessarily a problem that we have a space race. I think it's a beautiful thing. Because if you look back in the 1960s, right? 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. It scares the hell out of America. It seems like a problem, right? 13 years later, 12 really, we're on the moon, okay, with an iconic picture of Buzz Aldrin that even today almost represents modernity. The incredithat technological progress that we made during those years as a planet was due entirely to that fierce sense of international competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. 1974, we shake hands with the Soviets, handshake in space, and people are like, imagine how much more we can do together, okay? And they're up there at 250 miles in a 51-degree inclination orbit with the Soyuz capsule. Fast forward 60 years, we're still at a 51-degree inclination, 250 miles with the Soyuz capsule docked to a bigger space station, right? We have not done anything qualitatively amazing since then in national space. Commercial space, that's another story. And you mentioned, what's going on with Starship and, of course, Falcon Heavy and other things before that. But competition is a darn good thing. And the reason the commercial space sector is going good is Elon feels like he's in competition, right? And so I'm excited to have the Chinese as competitors. I don't want conflict, though. Conflict is scary, and we do talk about that in our book. And we open up with, a potential space EMP attack. That is scary, dangerous. The Russians, shortly after the book was published, or about the same time, basically threatened to orbit nuclear EMPs to take out Starlink, essentially. That's a bad day. We don't want that to happen, but we want to embrace this sense of national destiny that the Chinese have, frankly, and that we should have more of, and use that. So hopefully both teams get farther along to where we all want to be, which is, settling the solar system.
Okay. All right. It was kind of fun. I just want to throw in a fun thing. You had because you talk a lot about the history of our space program. That was really thorough and very interesting. But you also then in the next chapter, you went in on the history of private commercial space activities in the early days in particular, and just how difficult it was to get anybody's attention. But I thought I was pretty up on all that stuff. But you offered an amusing thing that I'd never heard of before, and it was back in the days of when David Hanna started Space Services, and he put some money into Gary Hudson to build the Percheron, and they built this thing and they were trying to move it. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, they were going to launch it, of course, off the Gulf Coast of Texas, but they had the thing over on the West Coast. Basically, they pretended it was a giant water heater, put it on a truck, and drove it across country. And in some places, they knew that there were going to be inspection stations they couldn't get through, so they off-roaded it in the night to essentially avoid the inspectors. And they got it there, and it blew up on the launch pad, but it came very close to being, the first commercial rocket in space. And of course, Gary did manage to get the first commercial rocket in space launch from that same island a few years later.
Yeah.
And most have never heard of it, so they don't know that there were commercial space launches in the early 1980s, along with, of course, Starstruck's Dolphin vehicle, which we talk about in the book, which was a really innovative hybrid launch system that launched from a floating tube out in the ocean. They did 3 launches off the coast of California. The third one came really close, and I think if they'd had enough money to go one more, they would have made it.
Yeah. Well, those early days, it's like there's a trail of wreckage, stringing along for years and years of a lot of different companies that try to do a lot of different things and hope for the best and just didn't get very far. And that's just a history of how we did things commercially. But
yeah, I think people find amusing stories. They're like the secret of who the first angel investor in commercial space was. It's Evel Knievel.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He paid Bob Truax, and probably not a lot of people know who he was either.
And again, I think Bob could have succeeded back in the 70s if he'd gotten the money.
And so was this guy Lutz Kaiser. Remember him?
Yeah.
He did that Volksrocket kind of concept. Unfortunately, he made the mistake of trying to fly out of Zaire, which scared a lot of people.
Or Autry. Volksrocket was Truax.
Autry, that's right. Volksrocket was Truax. Autry was a long, stretched out German name that I can't pronounce.
Yeah, and to be fair, the reason he had to go to Africa was that he was a German, and basically the Russians and the French agreed on one thing, which is they never wanted Germans to have rockets again, and they forced the German government to try to shut him down, so he fled. But again, he would have succeeded too, I think, if the government wasn't against him.
Well, the Israelis weren't too happy about the whole idea either, even from Zaire. Yeah,
went to Libya. In the end, he went to Libya, right?
Right. He had to flee Zaire.
That was not a good career move for him.
And I thought it was for a cheap thing. I thought it was this brilliant idea. It had these special, ground out, steel pipes that he put together in a big cluster, and it was diesel oil and nitric acid for fuel, using Volkswagen windshield wiper motors for pumps. All these things. So it's a relatively low impulse, but just the sheer size of it would get something moved somewhere. But you never really got to demonstrate it very much. You demonstrated a small, 4-cluster module from someplace, and then that was about it. But the history of this stuff is just amazing to me.
Yeah, I love it. So I put all that in there because I think it's important to understand the context when you look at policy choices today. What did we do wrong way back? We don't want to repeat.
Absolutely. Well, we can talk about the policy stuff because I know the real issue. I mean, we want to. You made it very clear. We need to beat China to the moon. We need to get there before they do, and not be second place and cede that high ground to them. Because as you have said, they're not real respecters of international agreements, and they're not respecters of property rights, and any kind of program that we go through with the world, that's going to actually succeed at expanding into space and having settlements there and having economic activity, those kind of things are very crucial. And so how do you counter that when they're out there, they have this national project, they're going to go to the moon, they're going to start mining it, and they don't really care.
Yeah. So, no, that's part of the thing that's driving us. And there's plenty for everybody, honestly, but the problem with the Chinese is they're extremely mercantilist. And if you look at their actual history on Earth, there's no reason to believe that they're going to behave any differently in space. And they run a good propaganda campaign here, on planet Earth. So that a lot of Americans and people in the West are totally unaware, but the country has a border conflict with every single one of its neighbors, right? India, Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, not to mention the countries they've occupied: Tibet, Inner Mongolia, East Turkestan. They are no respecters of other people's property. If they can take it, they just do. They say whatever they're going to say, and they sign treaties with the British about Hong Kong, and then they just ignore them. So this is problematic. And although I want everybody to go to the solar system, I don't want Xi Jinping thought to go to the solar system. So we've got to hold our ground there. At the very least, we can't cede the whole thing to them, or it's game over for humanity. I really think it's another 1,000-year dark ages under this Maoist ideology, and We don't want, re-education camps on the moon.
Yeah.
Talk about the South China Sea and the islands as an analogy for low Earth orbit, lunar environment, Lagrange points. Talk about how we see evidence now of their current actions that we can imply for their future actions.
Right. So in the South China Sea, it's an area that extends.
Uh-oh.
Well,
Okay.
Okay. That was a cliffhanger. There we go.
Let me repeat that.
Please, thank you.
Please.
The South China Sea is some water that extends 1,500 miles south of China's southern point, on the island of Henan. It just happens to be called South China Sea, and that's enough for them to say they own it. It's very much as though Mexico claimed the entire Gulf of Mexico, including the Florida and Louisiana coast, right?
Right.
That's basically their approach to that. It all belongs to us because it says China. In there, and one of the main reasons they're going there is there's fossil fuel deposits in relatively shallow waters around convenient little islands or shoals, the Spratlys, the Parcels, and these have been previously developed primarily by Vietnam and the Philippines, to which they are physically much closer. Mm-hmm. China basically said they're ours. They moved in starting in the 1970s, and they massacred Vietnamese that attempted to defend these. If you Google China shooting Vietnamese sailors in the South China Sea, you'll find something you don't want to see, because they filmed it too. But in any case, they took these very low-lying islands or shoals that are a little bit underwater over and started building artificial islands on top of them that they claimed were for research stations. The United States confronted them years ago about this. They said, no, it's just research. We promise we're not militarizing them. Well, now they're covered with airfields and missiles and everything else, and they're being used to start pushing the U.S. 7th Fleet out of that area. So one of China's strategic goals, beyond grabbing the resources, is to push the U.S. 7th Fleet, which has been the peacekeeper that allowed, frankly, Asia to boom for the last 70 years, because they haven't had any of the traditional wars that they used to have all the time. So the Japanese, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, all of those countries have not had to invest in defense or fight the wars they used to fight, and they've all been really economically prosperous. But by pushing the Americans out to another island chain, they'll be able to tell those countries what to do, essentially. And so there's no reason to believe that on the moon, for instance, there are strategic locations like the two Lagrange points about 50,000 miles off the surface of the moon. They've already put things there, right? And for communications nominally, but at some point they're going to say, these spots are taken, keep your satellites or operations out of here and go somewhere else. Well, there isn't somewhere else, because if you want to, for instance, as you know, Michael, put a space elevator from the moon, you've got to tether it at one of those 2 points, right, or both of them. So those are the Suez and Gibraltar of the cislunar environment. Super important. Then on the moon has lots of resources, but they are not evenly distributed. If you look at the USGS's lunar resource map that they've composed with radar scanning of the moon and other things, the metallic elements are concentrated in very clear areas, specifically near the south lunar pole. There's a giant mass which is estimated to be the size of the island of Hawaii. And it turns out, if you don't know, the island of Hawaii is the biggest mountain on Earth when measured from the seafloor. So this is a much bigger mineral concentration than any found on Earth. It also happens that water ice appears to be primarily in craters in the polar areas and more so in the southern polar areas. So that south polar area is really critical. And I noticed that every time the press talks about where Chinese landers are going, they're all excited because they're on, quote, the far side of the moon. Nobody's done that before, mostly because of communication purposes, but it's not like really harder to land on the far side of the moon. It's just you're out of communication. But guess what? The Chinese put a comm satellite at L2 so they can talk to that. But what they've really done that's important is they're on the far side of the moon near the South Pole, and that's where they've been pushing all their operations. So why wouldn't China put, say, a very sensitive scientific instrument like a radio telescope in the middle of, say, Shackleton Crater, where there's a potentially good deal of resources, and then say, we're drawing an exclusion zone around here under the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, and the non-interference doctrine and due regard says nobody else can go mess with their stuff. But unfortunately, the treaty doesn't say how big that zone is. So any country could assert, and you can expect the Chinese to assert aggressively. So very concerned about that. It's one of the reasons we've got to get our stuff on the ground sooner than later.
Absolutely. There is that, because there's also a practical side to that. You can create exclusion zones, you can do all those things, and you can make claims, to some extent. But it seems to be it's throughout history, you could really only keep what you can reasonably defend.
Yeah,
it comes to that in the end. I mean, there are lots of. I mean, we've argued, all of us, there's lots of resources out there in space. There should be plenty of it for everybody. And it seems absurd to me that we might, get into a battle over lunar ice.
Yeah, the military can defend things, and the military can break things, and the military can seize territory, but the military can't hold territory. Never in history has the military for more than like a generation been able to hold anything. It's like our experience in Afghanistan. You can throw a lot of bodies and money at something, but you don't own it unless you are developing it. And so I gave a talk at the Space Force's Space Future Conference that Joel Mosier hosted last year. And I started out with a picture of this little house on the prairie. And I asked if people knew what it was, and it is the little house on the prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder's home. And I said, this is what won the West. It wasn't General Custer and the 7th Cavalry, that's for sure, right? You could go in and massacre Native Americans, but if you actually want to hold the territory, it's the farmers, the ranchers, the telegraph, and the railroads that made that. So we've got to develop that infrastructure. It's got to be in concert with defense, and you also have to have rule of law. And this is a big problem we talked about in the book. The Outer Space Treaty, God bless it, was signed in kind of a kumbaya sort of mode. And one of the things it does is it prevents claims of sovereignty on the moon or celestial bodies. And that sounds really nice, because then everybody on Earth gets to participate. But if there's no sovereignty, meaning there's no government in charge of an area, either an Earth government or, the Lunar People's Federation or whatever, if there's no such thing allowed, then there's no rule of law. So nobody's in charge, and you get the Wild West. And we saw what that was like when, miners in the Black Hills of South Dakota founded Deadwood and started fighting.
The Wild West wasn't so wild when you really look at it. I mean, you knew who all the major criminals were by name. They weren't just roving packs of gangs of unnamed people that are going out robbing everybody. There was some rule of law in that these territorial claims actually became official U.S. territories. They did send marshals in. They did have a territorial government of some kind, because the goal was to become eventually a U.S. state. And so there was a process to all this, because it was in a culture that did try to protect property rights in some way. It was a westernized culture.
Black Hills. In the case of the Black Hills, the Treaty of Fort Laramie ceded that territory to the Native Americans, but didn't really provide any way for there to be any rule of law, because the Native Americans didn't have any bureaucracy or enforcement mechanism. Right. And miners just went in there, right? And eventually the U.S. military had to go in, but that whole process led to a whole series of Indian wars that were tragic. So establishing territories in advance and allowing claims to territories in a manner that operates under the rule of law, and then having somebody who's capable of interdicting and enforcing law is so critical. But right now we're in a situation where a vendor from a nominally U.S. company bumps into some Chinese state-owned science instrument. Who adjudicates this? I don't know. People will go yell at each other in the UN, but there's no real actual legal process, and there's no real way to do anything about it kinetically if it's necessary to to put in a corrective action. So we've got to figure that out.
Great.
Right. You anticipated my next question about that, because you've got these spaces. The Outer Space Treaty says you can't establish sovereignty, but the other people argue that doesn't mean you can't go in there and extract resources and use them on a commercial basis. You're not laying an official mining claim through a sovereign state. And so again, it goes back to you can keep what you can defend. So when we have two methodologies,
the United States interpreting that.
Go ahead.
So the United States in 2015, in an attempt to interpret the Outer Space Treaty in a commercially fair way, passed legislation that clearly says U.S. Commercial companies are allowed to extract resources and resell them. And the Artemis Accords, which we've got 43 nations, I believe, signed up now, require each nation in the Artemis Accords to agree to that principle, which is super important. But what it doesn't do is say that the company actually owns the land that they're mining, or that if they set up a processing facility on the moon or a factory, that they own that or that real estate. There are no real property rights. And this is important because real economies are not funded by venture capital. Mature economies are funded by banks, and banks don't write loans on property they can't collateralize. So if you can't transfer the property, meaning they can't seize something for a loan and default and sell it to somebody else, they're not going to loan on it. So we can't get to a mature space economy until we resolve this real property rights thing. Yeah. So we're getting there step by step, but we're not there yet policy-wise.
Yeah, okay. But there have been some famous workarounds that have been going on, like every spot in geosynchronous orbit. Nobody really owns that, but through an international commission that was set up, people do lease these things, and they buy and sell and trade key real estate in geosynchronous orbit all the time, but no one actually owns it. But we've been running the economy on it for 40 years.
Yeah, there's no equivalent to that agreement on the moon, but that is a useful agreement, and it works, and it's driven a mature economy where you can, in fact, collateralize that real estate.
Okay.
We need the same thing in LEO too, though, honestly.
Yep.
There are going to be valuable LEO orbits that people put their CLDs in, for instance, and they're going to want to be able to keep that spot so that when their CLD retires, they put another one in there and they can transfer that.
Okay. Well, so
you're wearing a U.S. Space Force T-shirt. So how does Space Force fit in this larger context? Not the Space Force of today. Like, we just hit our 5-year anniversary, so good that we've had Space Force for 5 years. That's actually quite impressive. But push out 5, 10, 15, 25 years. What role? Put on your crystal ball. Pull out your crystal ball and let us know what you think about. What do you think about Space Force's role? Fast forward. I know you're really into politics. Let's kind of push beyond the immediacy of politics and push out 10, 20 years. What is Space Force's role in managing, the next Spratly Islands or the next conflict? Or do they have a role for the 43, 45 nations involved with the Artemis Accords? Where do you think that's going to go? Because I think that's a pretty important policy element that hasn't been evaluated yet.
Yeah, I'm hoping they're the 7th Fleet of cislunar space, right?
Yeah.
And this is really important because originally, when the Air Force grudgingly allowed Space Force to be created because they had no choice.
So they didn't have a choice, right?
They still wanted Space Force's mission to be clearly as an addendum to the Air Force and other branches of the military that is there to provide communications, imaging, and other space-based resources, position, navigation, timing, to our ground-based warfighters and guarantee the Air Force air superiority. And that's their job, is to provide resources for the terrestrial warfare. the new commander of the Space Force, General Saltzman, Salty, has a new mission statement for the Space Force, which is right on task. And I forget the exact wording, but it's basically that the role of the Space Force will be to defend and protect America's interests to and from space, to, from, and in space. So it includes taking care of protecting our commercial assets in space. So I think that's the mission that they understand they have. They don't have the ability to do much of that. I'm not sure what the X-37B does, or if I did, I couldn't tell you, but we need to be able to grab things in space and remove them and relocate them, or if necessary, destroy them. Better to not leave crap up there. We need to be able to, on the moon, project force to interdict, to disable communications. We need to have position navigation and timing systems on the moon so that our systems and our allies can work effectively on the lunar surface. We need power and communication. I think Space Force can help develop that infrastructure as part of what they do.
Great. I love
so Space Force can help develop part of that.
Calling it the Seventh Fleet, as a former U.S. Marine, that feels very, very right. That there will be Space Marines as a part of Space Force. Yeah. All right. So within that context, we've had many orbital debris problems. Some of them we caused ourselves, some of them we caused through regulation, sometimes mishap, sometimes intentional. Where do you see regulation and policy moving towards debris, and specifically, the Chinese position on orbital debris, since their most recent anti-satellite test was, I think, very intentionally a domain denial tool, right? That they create a very large debris cloud, which they could have done differently and create a small debris cloud. Where do you think we're going with that stuff?
Yeah. So first of all, to be clear, and it's important that listeners understand that, because the media gets this all wrong, at least on the headline. You would think that the space congestion and debris problem is caused by like Elon Musk or commercial space companies that are launching a lot of satellites. These folks are being really responsible. Their rockets don't leave boosters in orbit. They come back down and they land precisely, and the second stages get deorbited. And when they find out deorbited exactly the way that we might like in some debris, then they correct that, and they're working on it constantly. The satellites for Starlink, for instance, if they don't perform, they're deorbited, and even if they completely fail and communications lost, they're going to come down anyway in 18 to 24 months. It is not a problem. What is a problem, and 75% of the debris up there is created by governments, specifically probably in order of magnitude, China, Russia, and the United States, and then Europe maybe. But this was created by governments, and governments have a responsibility to clean it up. The last thing that should happen is to put a tax on commercial space launches to fix the orbital debris problem. And I keep hearing that idea, and that is just so backwards. The government owes the commercial space operators a functional domain. They screwed it up. They need to clean it up. Now, I don't think this would really happen, but this is what I would do, Michael, is I would say that these governments that caused the problem need to put together a fund, essentially, for the cleanup. And then we identify, of the 30,000 or so objects up there that we know about, which ones are the biggest hazard based on their orbital inclinations, their altitudes, and their size. And some of the big ones, like these Russians in it, boosters up there the size of school buses, are really dangerous. We prioritize those first. We put a dollar amount on them, okay? Anybody can go get them. The government of China could do it. The Russian government, state or organizations could do it. An American commercial company could do it, or, I don't know, a company from Belgium. I don't care. Whoever goes and gets it gets the bounty. You don't pay anything until the job is done, right? You simply commit to paying to solve the problem. That way we're not like picking winners and losers or investing in technologies that might be a failure or launching a big government program that'll take forever to get the job done. We simply say, we're willing to pay for it. This is how much. These are the priorities. Go get them. I would love that to happen. I'm sure the Chinese won't cooperate. But,
could we modify the EPA rules for Superfund? I live in the Seattle region in a town called Tacoma, and our Superfund site is now a jewel of a park, right? So you can turn those things around if you've got the right incentives.
Yeah,
exactly.
Question before we go. We're going to be shutting it down soon here, but I got a question because we mentioned the Artemis Accords a few times, and they've borrowed a lot from the Outer Space Treaty, and they have a lot of interesting things attached to them. But here's my question: it's a little bit odd. Can we have the Artemis Accords, but not have Artemis?
Yes, you can. You could.
I'm serious as a heart attack, man. This is, because we all had this email thread the other day because we had that article from Bloomberg. He was going on and on about how expensive this all is, how it's such a waste of money, and we have been talking about this for 10 years. What a waste of resources.
Let me address that with you. Is there a language filter on this channel?
No.
Yeah.
Michael Bloomberg is an asshole. Okay. And just anything he says because he's a complete snake and he's got another agenda. Now he may be right about something or technically, but he invested millions of dollars back in 2018 and attacked strategically members of the United States Congress who were supporters of space, including Dana Rohrabacher, who was probably the best advocate for commercial space. He put over $10 million in negative ads on Dana, who Dana and his wife Rhonda usually spent like a few $100,000 on the campaign. Dana, a good friend of mine. He went after Steve Knight, another California congressman, big supporter of space, and he went after John Culberson, who made the Europa Clipper mission a reality. And in those ads, he made ads mocking John Culberson's support for space science with a video of aliens in a flying saucer chasing Congressman Culberson, and it said $390 million wasted on looking for life on Europa. That's from Bloomberg. Anyway.
But
yes, you can have Artemis Accords without Artemis, but part of Artemis is bringing the international community along on the ride with the U.S. so they don't do it with the China-Russia International Research Lunar Station thing. So parts of the architecture for Gateway and stuff irritates some engineers who don't think that's the best way to do it. But on the other hand, it's a Japanese module. It's got components from countries all over the world, like the International Space Station. There are reasons to do these things, right? I know we'd love a full Starship stack to the moon. I like that too, but it's a single vendor, single country solution. It's going to be hard to generate the enthusiasm across congressional districts and around the world. So I want to do that single stack Starship thing. I also want to look at these other things we can do with other countries and companies because we need everybody on board going to the moon.
Okay.
You just changed my opinion on something. Nice job, Art. That's good
for a Seattle guy. I know it's
now
okay.
It's all going to make financial sense too, and there's ways to do that, but we need a whole nother show.
Yeah. Well, we'll have you back, and we'll do that show. That might be really interesting. Okay. Anyway, Greg Autry, writer, Forbes Science contributor, educator, tech startup founder. I should have led with this. Researcher on entrepreneurship, commercial space and economics, and gadfly about town. Former NASA appointee and an associate provost for space commercialization and strategy at the University of Central Florida, and my new neighbor. Thank you so much for coming. It was great.
Thank you for having me. Great talk. Good to see you, Michael.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Okay, that's the news we find interesting. This October 22nd. Now, in 2 weeks, stay tuned for an announcement because while the next show is technically scheduled for November 12th, I personally am scheduled for a medical procedure the previous day, Monday the 11th. And so we'll either postpone until the 26th of November, or we'll carry on with a guest host topic to be determined. We'll make that decision in the next couple of days and put the word out to everybody in our network, and you'll find out what's going on there. So see you next time. And from the news desk at the Center for Space Commerce and Finance, I'm Thomas Andrew.